All right, guys, welcome to the first installment of. I mean, it's gonna be called story analysis, but I will say like it's the Let's Fix It series. Now, before we get into the specifics of this movie, I think it's important to kind of just talk about what I think overall is an issue when it comes to reviewing or talking about movies like this. First of all, this movie would have never gotten made as the way it is if the director was not Christopher Nolan. Let's just be honest here. The movie is extremely long, 3 hours. It's about a topic that I think it is relevant now, especially with the world in turmoil. But I think it's not so relevant that like a big studio like Universal would go into a bidding war for a script if the script's writer and the attached director was not Christopher Nolan. Now, this is not me bashing Christopher Nolan. I think good for him. I think he's done amazing work. He's one of my favorite directors. And he has banked a lot of goodwill with commercially successful movies. And I think it's nice to see a studio back a director when she wants to do something that's maybe a little more out there. But on the flip side, let's also be honest with ourselves and just say and call it for what it is, that Christopher Nolan's last, I would say, few movies has been more esoteric and hard for the mainstream audience to get behind, to even understand. I think Interstellar was a very good experiment. It was a good experience, but it was almost borderline an experimental film in a lot of ways when it came to storytelling, when it came to the visuals, when it came to the ideas that it was trying to discuss. Tenant, I mean, just by looking at the trailer for Tenant, you knew that this movie was going to be hard to understand. And I think if you spend hours trying to dissect the way the time thing worked, I'm sure it would make sense. But as a movie experience, when you're just watching it at full speed in the movie theater, it's almost impossible for anyone to just get right away, and that I think ruins the experience for most people. And then this movie, and then I think this movie added the three. I mean, when I say it's three, I mean Interstellar, Tenet, and this movie. Out of these three, this one is the easiest to understand because it's based on a real event, a real person, and I think the audience more or less has a background understanding of the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, World War II, etc. So automatically, I think this movie is much easier to get behind, to get into. But I also think this movie out of the three is the least entertaining because I think it's missing the most story elements. And I suspect that a few people will say, like, well, why does every story need to have all the story elements? Why can't a director or a filmmaker kind of go off the beaten path and do something a little more unique, a little more experimental? Was that the worst thing in the world? Well, it's not, right? Like I would also say that this movie is broke new ground in terms of the visuals, in terms of performance. I think this movie is the best performed movie, and when I say performance, I mean the actors, that I've seen in a very long time. But the reason why I hold this movie to the same standard as, say, like Barbie, which is the movie that came out on the same weekend in the States, is that you're paying the same money to watch the movies, right? Like this movie is competing with movies like Barbie because they cost the same to the audience, and this movie actually costs more because it's actually longer. This movie is 3 hours, whereas opposed to Barbie, which is I think an hour and almost 40 minutes. So this movie by itself is much harder for the audience, but it demands more from the audience to get into. But the price is the same. You're paying the same amount of money, right? So in a lot of ways, the fact that this movie is missing a lot of core story elements is a problem, because a movie like Barbie is not. And I always say straight up that Barbie is going to be much more appealing to the mainstream audience than Oppenheimer. That's just the way it is, guys. Yeah, you can say like, well, I enjoyed Oppenheimer more because it was whatever, it was more visually appealing, had better acting and music and etc. And that's fine, but just because you enjoy something doesn't mean this thing is objectively good, right? Like, you enjoying something doesn't mean it's good, and it doesn't mean it's bad. Like, if you're saying like, oh, I enjoyed Barbie, it doesn't mean that movie is good. And if you said I didn't enjoy Oppenheimer, it doesn't mean this movie is automatically bad, right? So I think it's important to stay objective and to take Christopher Nolan's name out of the conversation and just to judge a movie by what is on the screen, right? And I think that's hard to do, because I think a lot of people buy a movie ticket because of the name tag attached to the film. And why not? Like, I mean, if I would say that, like, a director or an actor or anyone on the cast and crew, if they have marketing potential, you should use it as a marketing tool, right? So I think Christopher Nolan is a big name. You buying a ticket because he's attached to this project is totally understandable. But when it comes to analyzing the story of a movie, I think it's important just to judge it fairly, and to do that is to take everything out of it and just focus on what's on the screen. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the 3-hour runtime. And I think some people might think like, well, isn't longer better because you're getting more content for the amount of money you're paying? And I guess you can look at it that way, but if you've ever written a screenplay or tried to write a screenplay or try to make a movie, you know that usually the opposite is true, that the shorter a screenplay is, the shorter a movie is, the better it is. The shorter a movie is usually better because there's more craft that goes into it, and the more structurally sound it is, the shorter it is. Obviously, there's a limit to it. You don't want your movie to be too short, because then you'll have the same problem as a movie that's too long. And in my experience, most movies, and when I say most, I mean like 99% of movies, don't need to be 3 hours long. I would say 95% of the movies don't need to be over 2 hours long, right? And yeah, but obviously there are movies that should be 3 hours long, like, Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight Rises was 3 hours or close to 3 hours, and I think every minute of that movie is warranted. Titanic, over 3 hours, I think that's like 3 hours and a half, and every minute is warranted. But this movie, the 3 hour runtime is very suspect. And I would say definitively that it is not necessary, and we will go into why that is. The second point, and I think the key issue with Oppenheimer, is the antagonist slash key conflict, aka there is none. The antagonist you might think is the character Strauss, played by Robert Downey Jr., and the key conflict is inherent in the difficulty of creating something like the atomic bomb. But when we get into it, you'll see you'll see why this is not the case, and why there is actually no antagonist and there is actually no key conflict solved in this movie. And obviously, when we're talking about any of these issues, it's important to think like, in the back of your mind, think like, why are these issues, right? Why do we need antagonists? Why do we need key conflicts? Because let's be honest here, guys, like when I was watching this movie, a lot of times, yeah, I was thinking about these issues, but a lot of times I was just having a good time. Like, I was watching the movie and I was totally engrossed in what I was seeing. But I understand that that might be like a personal reaction to the movie, because I really like Cillian Murphy. I really like Emily Blunt. I really like Matt Damon, and these actors absolutely killed it in this movie, and they carried the film. Like, Cillian Murphy's performance absolutely carried this movie. The music was out of this world. And I think those elements really helped paper the cracks of the story, right? Like, I think these are major story cracks, and elements like acting and music cinematography just kind of covered them up. But I would say that most people, and most people, I say mass audiences, like the people that I went to watch this movie with, they did not have a good time. They were bored. They wanted to leave. They didn't know what they were watching, and they didn't know why they should keep watching. Number three is the protagonist's character growth and a struggle. Again, there's a thing about it, like, and we talked about this in our Fundamentals of Screenwriting video series, why a protagonist needs to grow slash struggle. This goes to the film's theme, and a theme is usually portrayed through a protagonist's growth. And this movie's main protagonist, Oppenheimer, does not have any sort of growth. He barely has any sort of struggle. When I say struggle, I mean inner struggle. It's funny because the movie starts out with his anxiety attack. He has these like anxiety attacks. He has these dreams. He's dreaming of, like, I think nuclear fission or fusion or whatever, and he's struggling with it in his youth. But as soon as the Manhattan Project begins, he kind of just gets over it, and it's not discussed again. Like his anxiety problem. It was really strange. Like his character just goes out the window. His characterization just goes out the window as soon as the Manhattan Project starts, and never comes back. And I like, again, like I said, Cillian Murphy's performance just carries the whole movie, but he really didn't have a lot to work with. And that just goes to how well of a performance he gave. But I just feel like if he had more of a character to work with, it would have been even better. And that's the thing, guys. Like, obviously, I think a lot of people have watched this movie and had a good time. I think a lot of people, despite all the story issues, would have enjoyed their time with this film. So then you ask the question, like, well, why are these story elements important? Well, because these story elements, these core story elements, would have made the movie better. There has never been a time in my 10 plus years of screenwriting slash story editing have I ever come across a topic or a story that is improved by eliminating core story elements. It's only gotten better, right? If you have a good structure, if you have the proper story elements added together with a good topic and good everything else, it only makes the end product better. Okay, number 4 is the courtroom drama as a framing device. So the Manhattan Project took place in 1942, concluded in 1945 with the successful invention of the atomic bomb, and it pretty much ends the war after the atomic bomb was used on Japan. This movie has 2 courtroom drama storylines that happen after the Second World War. One is a hearing where Oppenheimer's allegiance to the United States is put into question, and the second courtroom drama is Strauss's Senate appointment, I think, and I think, yeah, and it's him wanting to become like a senator, and then being questioned about his relationship with Oppenheimer during I guess after the war or during the war or something like that. So the problem with this is that there are two courtroom dramas used as a framing device, and it's just too much. Like, they tried to separate the courtroom dramas by making one of them black and white, just to not confuse the audience as to the timeline of when these things were happening and what we were watching. But it's just too much, guys. Why? We'll talk about it. It's the main reason is because these courtroom dramas don't have anything to do with the actual creation of the atomic bomb, right? This movie, if you ask anyone what Oppenheimer is about, you will say it's about the guy who led the Manhattan Project and created the first atomic bomb. This is the concept of this movie. Yeah, you can say this movie talks more about his life as a whole, but come on, guys, like, you know that most people who will want to watch this movie based on the concept is going to watch it because they want to see the creation of the atomic bomb. They want to see how it was made. And the fact that these courtroom dramas don't have anything to do with that is a big problem because they take up so much time. The reason why this movie is 3 hours, and it doesn't have to be 3 hours, because so much time is given to storylines that don't contribute to the central dramatic question, which is how did they create the atomic bomb during World War II? That is the reason why these courtroom dramas, or at least one of them, is redundant, to say the least, and I would say just completely unnecessary. Number 5 is the idea of chain reaction as a metaphor. So this is a key story idea that we haven't talked about, but maybe it's kind of high level, but I don't think it is. I think it's easy to understand that to make a story something historical, relevant to a modern day audience that doesn't really care about something that happened 70 or like 70 years ago. Like, how do you make people care? Well, it's to find the metaphor of the story. So you use, basically what you have to do is use a concept of the plot, which in this case is the creation of the atomic bomb, and use it as a metaphor to talk about some sort of like character growth or theme that everyone can relate to, no matter when they watch this, right? Or how old they are. So the plot concept they use is the chain reaction, right? They need to create a chain reaction to create the bomb. The explosion is based on a chain reaction, right? That they gain by splitting the atom. I think that's how it is. And they use this chain reaction concept over and over again, and they needed to find a metaphor for this chain reaction as a metaphor for life or the human condition or history or whatever, right? And they almost had it. They almost did it, but it's not quite as clear. And if they actually cleared this up, the movie would have been much more powerful as a dramatic piece. And I think that is the key issue I have with this movie, is that this movie is not really a dramatic narrative. It's more of like a dramatic retelling of a real event. It's kind of almost like, how you have those documentaries where they have like dramatic reenactments for certain parts. Just imagine that, but imagine the whole movie being that, and you kind of have the result of Oppenheimer. Obviously, the dramatic reenactments are very well done, but they are reenactments and they lack structure. They lack story elements to make it a narrative experience. Okay, so we're going to talk about the plot as it is, right? Okay, so the movie, the protagonist is a single protagonist. It's our boy Oppenheimer. His success, what he wants, the plot is to create atomic bomb. It's a more of something story archetype. If you haven't watched our video on story archetypes, I suggest you go take a look. It'll be very, very helpful. And right now, the obstacles in his way are two people, Groves, which is Matt Damon, and Strauss, which is played by Robert Downey Jr. Okay? Now, this might seem strange because Groves, I think he starts off as a lieutenant or becomes a general, I'm not sure. I forget. General Groves, he ends up, is the one that recruits Oppenheimer to lead the Manhattan Project, but throughout the Manhattan Project, he actually creates some kind of obstacles for him. His security clearance, he's not allowed to go places, etc. So he creates some obstacles for Oppenheimer during the Manhattan Project. And Strauss, he is the one who is openly, or I guess secretly, opposed to Oppenheimer because they have like bad history. Oppenheimer embarrassed him during a hearing where Oppenheimer opposed the export of, I guess, isotopes or something like that. So Strauss has this personal vendetta against Oppenheimer, and he wants to smear him or ruin his reputation, as it were, by setting up this kangaroo court, this hearing where they question Oppenheimer's allegiance to the United States. The problem with these obstacles as I said in our introduction, is that none of these people, Groves and Strauss, actively contributes to obstructing the creation of the atomic bomb, right? Like they don't obstruct the creation of the atomic bomb at all. And that is a problem. Like because if your plot is creating the atomic bomb, then I need to see some obstacles. I need to see the obstacles they face when creating the atomic bomb. And yeah, you can say like, well, this movie is more about Oppenheimer's character as opposed to the actual creation of the atomic bomb. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not the concept, right? Like, you can't just be like, okay, well, this movie is called Oppenheimer. He created the atomic bomb. All our marketing material is about is these explosions and like these great shots of nuclear fission and then how important it is to create the atomic bomb. And then when the audience gets in there, you don't talk about creating the atomic bomb at all, but instead you talk about, Oppenheimer's like family affairs and like his ideas about human cooperation. Yeah, these are fine elements to have, but come on, guys, like people want to watch this. They want to watch the creation of the atomic bomb, and just not enough content in 3 hours around the central concept. Like it's just ridiculous, guys. Like I don't know what to say. Like I understand that creating the atomic bomb is a very complicated process, but you as a movie maker, filmmaker, if you decide to tackle this topic, then you need to do it properly. This can't be like, well, this is too hard, it's too complicated, so like we're not gonna like touch it, right? We're just gonna ignore it and just focus on like this person. And the other problem by focusing on just Oppenheimer's character is, like I said in the beginning, he actually has no character because he doesn't have any sort of like interesting character flaws or character setups that is throughout the movie. Like he has anxiety attacks when he's young, right? Like we said, but he doesn't have them anymore. He magically solves his anxiety problems, like just as soon as the Manhattan Project starts. And so what's his other problem? He's a womanizer. He has an affair with a member of the Communist Party of America, and that's it. But the affair gets solved again for him. Gets solved for him because the woman he's having an affair with kills herself. It doesn't linger. It doesn't stretch throughout the whole movie. It doesn't sustain his character throughout the whole movie because it finishes by itself very quickly. So then you tell me what I'm watching. Like, I'm not watching this. I'm not watching them create the atomic bomb because there's no obstacles in the way of this. So this is just happening. It's just going to happen. It's just going to finish by itself, apparently. And Oppenheimer's character is just paper thin, and you got Cillian Murphy here just killing himself every scene, trying to eke out every little drama in this character. I just feel for him. He does a great job. I just feel like, God, this guy, how did he do it, man? I don't know how he did it. He just create awesome drama from nothing. I think he deserves every accolade coming to him. Like he deserves every single award available to performance. He was amazing. Like, guys, come on. He just killed it. So we're going to summarize what we just talked about. One, there's no direct obstacle to the Manhattan Project, right? There's no scientific obstacle that was solved. Like, there was what? Two scenes where when they talk about science stuff. The first one was in the very beginning when they said that, okay, well, it's going to take a long time to refine uranium or refine plutonium, right? They have this big fishbowl for uranium, and they need time to fill up this fishbowl, or they had to fill one up, because that's how long it would take. That's how much refined uranium it would take to make a bomb. And then they have the small cup, which is the amount of refined plutonium that they need. But again, these are not issues that they need to solve, right? They're not involved in the refinement of these elements. It's just like a time thing, right? They're like, well, it's gonna take some time, guys, so let's just get ready, right? Again, like they're the Oppenheimer's team is not involved in refining uranium or refining plutonium, and they didn't do anything to help solve or speed up the refinement process, right? So this is not part of the plot at all, right? This is just like a reminder of how far ahead the refinement is going. The second scene they had was with the discussion of whether to make an atomic bomb or a hydrogen bomb. A scientist named Teller, who is a pretty prominent character, he proposes to create the hydrogen bomb, which is much more powerful. And Oppenheimer opposes this idea because he doesn't feel like a hydrogen bomb is necessary. And if they did create a hydrogen bomb, it would send a signal to the Soviet Union that they're doing something that's totally unnecessary, and that will only spur the Soviet Union to create a hydrogen bomb of their own, and then a arms race would ensue, which is exactly what happened. But this is like a key concept that this movie should have elaborated on. But again, this movie, the way it is, they only talk about it really like between Teller and Oppenheimer, they only talk about it once. And then they talk about it here and there a little bit, right? But it's not a key issue. It's not a direct obstacle to the Manhattan Project. It's not like, a bunch of people were like, hey, we're not going to make the atomic bomb anymore. We're going to make the hydrogen bomb instead. And that slows down the Manhattan Project, or puts the Manhattan Project in jeopardy, etc. Right. Number two, Strauss did not interfere with the Manhattan Project, right? So Strauss, he is the, I guess, chair of the AEC, which is the Atomic Energy Committee, I think is what it stands for, the AEC. And he did not interfere with the Manhattan Project. There was one scene during, I guess, a dinner meeting type of round table between Strauss and the scientists, where Strauss showed Oppenheimer like a graph of this Soviet Union testing they did of an atomic bomb or hydrogen bomb, and Strauss was like, hey, look at this, they have already started testing, so you need to get on this, right? And then Oppenheimer's like, no, we can't make the hydrogen bomb, it's too whatever, right? And that's it. Strauss did not actively stop or hinder the Manhattan Project in any way. And why would he, right? Like, he, for all intents and purposes, wants the Manhattan Project to go ahead, to finish, right? Because that's what he wants. That's what everyone wants. And that's the problem with doing an historical film, because sometimes the source material, aka history, doesn't present you with very clear obstacles to put in the way of your plot. Well, then if that is the case, then you as the filmmaker need to find the obstacle that makes this historical event interesting. And if you can't find it, then maybe you shouldn't make this movie. Then maybe it means that this movie is not meant to be made into a movie. But I don't believe this is the problem, because I'm sure the Manhattan Project, creating the first atomic bomb, was hard as hell, guys. It must have been so difficult. And just to gloss over the scientific parts of it, to gloss over the politics behind the Manhattan Project, it's just astounding to me. I just don't understand why they couldn't find any sort of like clear conflict, clear obstacles when it came to this project, being completed. And finally, the World War II background was not explained. Now, this is super important because I feel like this, although this movie is not directly like a war film, it kind of is, because it actually is, the background is actually quite important. A little bit of a history lesson this movie should have mentioned was the reason why the Manhattan Project was on such a tight deadline. In this movie, they explained it through Matt Damon when he was saying like, "Oh, we need the test to be completed before Stalin meets with Truman, President Truman, during Potsdam, which is in July. Germany surrendered in May of that year, I think. But in July, Stalin and Truman was going to have a get together meeting in Potsdam, and then they were going to talk about the war in the Pacific. And they needed a working prototype, or they needed the atomic bomb testing to be completed at the time, so Truman will have more leverage when he talked to Stalin. Right? That's not. I mean, that's fine, but the historical significance, I would say, is not explained well, because the reason why the US needed to finish the Manhattan Project before a certain time was because, well, the Soviet Union was about to invade Japan. Like, they were going to do it, they were getting ready, and if they invaded Japan and if they took over Tokyo, well, and then Japan surrendered, well, during the negotiations, the Soviet Union would be like, well, we sacrificed our boys, we died for Japan's surrender, so Japan should be ours, right? We should control Japan. And the US was not going to let that happen. The US wanted Japan as kind of like their gateway, or their like buffer in Asia, and they were going to do everything to make that happen. So that means they had to make Japan surrender to them before the Soviet Union attacked, because as soon as Soviet Union attacked Japan, obviously they would not use the atomic bomb on Japan, right? That was not going to happen. So that's the real reason, or that's more of a reason why the Manhattan Project was on such a tight deadline. And as you know, deadlines, time locks, are very good for a story. But this one was just not explained properly, and the World War II background was just not used, I think, to its full potential. So having said all of this, let's look at how we should go about fixing the plot, based on everything that we just talked about. So the character and the plot goal stays the same, right? We still have Oppenheimer, we still have creating the atomic bomb as the main plot, but here the obstacles are where we make the biggest change, right? So I would say that you need to find a science thing to solve. Now, I understand, like I said, that creating the atomic bomb is extremely difficult and esoteric, and I'm sure nuclear fission, explaining nuclear nuclear fission or fusion or whatever is hard. Okay, I get it. But if you're gonna do this thing, if you're gonna do this topic, then you need to find a way to dumb it down, so like Bob in Arizona, who's taken his kids on the weekend to watch this movie, will watch something like this and be like, hey, I feel like I kind of understand a little bit more about creating an atomic bomb or nuclear fission, right? You want the audience to feel smart. You want the audience to feel like they learned something, even if what they learn is just like super surface level. But you need to do it. Like, that's part of movie fun. Like, you want people to go in there and watch something like this and come out and be like, hey, you know how like when they made the atomic bomb, did you know, like whatever, right? Like, that's super important. And this movie just like glosses over the science part. Like, they don't solve any sort of key or difficult science problem. And they need it. Like, this is the concept, guys. Like, if you can't figure it out, then you're not ready to make this movie. You're not ready to make this subject. And if you can't make a key concept understandable in the movie to a general audience, then you know what? You're just not ready to do this topic. You need to think more. You need to understand the topic more until you can explain it clearly and precisely and make it easy to understand to a mass audience. Second is time lock. Like we said, if you use the World War II background properly, you can have a nice time lock for the project. And the third one is the spy. Guys, they had it. So I'm thinking, like, when you're thinking about how to make a script better, it's important to use elements that are already in the script or in the movie, as is this case, right? In this movie, they had like this spy character who was feeding information to the Soviet Union. And in the end, after everything was done, they mentioned like, oh, hey, by the way, we found the spy. It was the British scientist named Fuchs or something, I think. We found them. Don't worry about it. Like, how is this not more of a thing? Like, how is this not used as a key problem in the movie? Like, can you imagine like how much better it would have been if like they had to create the atomic bomb all the while trying to like root out a spy among them? Like, isn't that this movie is labeled as a thriller? And this, so having a spy, is a thriller element. But you know what? This spy does not exist in this current version of the movie. Like, it's talked about, it's mentioned, right? But it's only mentioned a lot after the Manhattan Project is over, when like they suspect Oppenheimer is a spy. I'm not saying you can't suspect Oppenheimer as a spy, but why isn't the spy a more integral part of the Manhattan Project as it was going on? Like, come on, guys. Like, isn't that like a classic thriller setup where you have to make something, you have to create something, but at the same time you have to like figure out like who amongst you is like the bad guy, who's like the Russian spy, like, doesn't that sound thrillery? Like, come on. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe this was not more of a thing. And number four, Strauss. I think if you're gonna have an antagonist, Strauss should be the antagonist, because again, he's the guy who's directly opposed to Oppenheimer. It's more aligned with history, and I have him here as like a dark mentor, because he as the head of the Atomic Energy Committee, like, he's not opposed to creating the atomic bomb. Hell, he's not even opposed to creating the hydrogen bomb. So, like, he should be like the dark mentor who needs Oppenheimer to create these nuclear weapons, but he lies to Oppenheimer and says, hey, yeah, we're gonna just win the war, we're not gonna make any more atomic weapons. But then after the war, he goes against his word and starts creating the hydrogen bomb program, etc., right? That's just an option. But I think as a dark mentor, it would have made a much more sense, as opposed to having someone who's just opposed to the Manhattan Project, because the Manhattan Project is important for the safety of American lives at the time, right? So it wouldn't make any sense for someone to openly oppose ending the war early. But I think this movie, the central dramatic question of this movie, is actually not just creating the atomic bomb, right? It's actually, on the theme level, it's actually more about discussing the whether humans are ready for the atomic age, whether we can work together to not destroy ourselves, right? And that's the topic that this movie discusses, and I feel like Strauss, on that level, on that discussion, can be the bad guy, right? And the creation of the atomic bomb then we will use these elements to create obstacles for the atomic bomb, right? And then Strauss is more on the thematic struggle level. So if you take a look at the theme as it is, it's pretty bare bones, despite being 3 hours and not having a real of a plot, and talking about a whole bunch of stuff. It actually doesn't really talk about anything significant. I would say that Albert Einstein as a character is probably the closest thing we have to a pure theme character, because he's not involved in the Manhattan Project in any sort of like scientific capacity, and he talks to Oppenheimer about stuff, and his conversation with Oppenheimer is used as like a kind of a frame for this movie. So he tells Oppenheimer a lot about, like, philosophy, I guess, and the key philosophy he repeats to him is that he needs to prepare to take on the burden of success, just like how Albert Einstein had to do when he created quantum mechanics, right? If you're going to change the world, you have to be prepared for the consequences. And on the opposite side, on the negative theme level, we have the idea of the chain reaction, right? Like, the movie ends with Oppenheimer telling Albert Einstein that he thinks that he created this chain reaction that's going to lead to the destruction of the world. So this idea of the chain reaction, it's on the negative theme, right? It's the negative aspect of creating the atomic bomb. It's a negative aspect. It's used as a metaphor, or is used to explain the dark side of humanity. But again, it's not very clear, right? It's not very clear, and when we fix this, we need to clear this up. So if we look at fixing the theme, then we should look at just more clearly like what the movie is trying to tell us, right? So I feel like this idea that mankind will cooperate is something that Oppenheimer firmly believes. He repeats it time and time again. He believes that we as in the United States, can work with the Soviets, and we can come to an agreement where neither of us creates a hydrogen bomb. We are allies in this war. As long as we talk to each other, we can avoid an arms race and avoid a mutual assured self-destruction, right? And on the opposite side, we have Strauss, who I think his philosophy should be that a chain reaction cannot be stopped. He can be like, oh, hey, Oppenheimer, stop being so naive. Like, you started this, or you didn't even start this. This thing started way before you even was born or whatever. Like, you're just a part of this chain reaction. Like, this chain reaction started years ago, right, between the Soviet Union and the United States, and you are just a cog you're just one part of this chain, right? So you can't stop it. Like creating the hydrogen bomb is going to happen whether you want it to or not, because when the chain reaction starts, it can't be stopped, right? And this by clearing up the theme and stating it like this, just clarifies it, right? It just clarifies what I think this movie is trying to say. And clarity is always better than not clarity, right? I think some people might think like, well, like I like a movie when the theme is less clear. You have to think about it. I mean, it's actually not though, right? Like in most movies, like classic cinema, the theme is actually very clear. Like the message of the movie is actually very clear. Like you know exactly what the movie is trying to tell you. It's most of the time it's those movies where the filmmaker is not really clear what he or she wants to say, that they hide behind veils and layers of dialogue or layers of ideas that so it could be anything, but because it can be anything, it's actually not anything, it's actually nothing, right? So the strong and confident filmmaker puts him or herself out there and just states the theme for everyone to think about, to contemplate, to argue against or argue for. And I think that's what this movie's almost there. I think this movie has a very clear message what it's trying to portray. I just think it's not presented clearly. But I think the message is clear that we as a species cannot stop the chain reactions that we create. Or perhaps chain reactions are not even our creation, that everyone is just part of a chain reaction anyways. Whatever, right? Like I think these are nice themes to discuss. The movie ends on this chain reaction idea. I just felt like if it was more clear what Christopher Nolan was trying to say, that would have been better. All right, finally, we're going to talk about the 3-act structure, what we need to do to make what we need to do structurally to incorporate all of our changes. Right. So we're going to use the Oppenheimer hearing. We're going to keep one. Right? We're going to keep one of the hearings. The Oppenheimer hearing is the more relevant one, as a framing device and a key explainer of story elements. So the good thing about framing devices is that not only does it create a in and out point of your movie, and it makes the whole thing more structurally more pleasing if you have like a beginning and end that's like the same time. So like in Titanic it's like this, and Saving Private Ryan is like this. Lots of movies use a different time to use as a framing device. But the good thing about framing devices is that it also you can cut away from the main story, which essentially is a flashback, right? If you have a framing device like this, and then you can cut away from the flashback main story and use the framing device to explain what just happened. They do this a lot in Titanic. It kind of also works as like a break because the movie is so long in Titanic that if you cut away from it and then you just talk about what just happened, it gives the audience kind of like a breather, you know. And I think this movie needed that, right? Like I think because this movie is scientifically much more complicated than something like Titanic, that it actually would have been nice to like, if you're gonna make more of an effort to explain some sort of sciencey stuff, to cut away from that explanation, go into your framing device, and then have Oppenheimer explain it again, right? Like that would have clarified much more the sciencey parts of it, right? I think that would have helped a lot. Number two is the midpoint. The midpoint right now is pretty good. The midpoint right now is Germany surrendering, and then they question the purpose of continuing research. So this is as is. This is the way the movie is right now, which is great. I just wanted to point that out. Just we can keep this midpoint. I think is structurally probably the best part of probably the best decision that they made structurally. But I just wanted to point that out, right? Not everything is bad. I still we have to talk about the good with the bad, right? Number three, danger closes in is the part that comes after the midpoint, and then we should create a time lock with the Russians' invasion of Japan, right? So after the midpoint, where we're like, okay, well, we started this Manhattan Project because, you know, we wanted to use it to defeat Germany, but now that Germany has surrendered, should we still, you know, go forward with this project that could eventually lead to the destruction of the human race? But then very quickly, the U.S. government's like, you must finish this before the Russians invade Japan, or else, you know, we're gonna be like at a disadvantage in the beginning of the Cold War, right? So this I think is super natural. I think this is the best way of going about the plot after the midpoint. And finally, Strauss's secret plan is to create a hydrogen bomb program, sets up hearing as a way to discredit Oppenheimer. Now, this, I would say, take with a grain of salt, or to just think about it as a possibility and not the best solution because of history, right? Because Strauss in history, he's a real character, he's a real person. So when we're creating something like this, it's important to stay as close to history as possible. But because we want him to be the main antagonist, right? So he needs to do something that's in direct opposition to Oppenheimer. The way the story is right now, he sets up this hearing to discredit Oppenheimer purely because he hates him, purely because Oppenheimer embarrassed him years ago, right, at the hearing. So this like fake hearing, or not fake hearing, like this hearing that Strauss set up is like a personal vendetta. It's like a revenge thing for him, right? It doesn't actually help him become a senator. Well, I don't think it does. Like, I don't understand how him becoming a senator requires him to discredit Oppenheimer, right? Because this whole hearing, what it does is that it discredits Oppenheimer and takes away his security clearance, so he can no longer act as an advisor to the AEC, the Atomic Energy Committee. And the only reason why Strauss, from a story perspective, will want that to happen is if he wants to create a hydrogen bomb program, and Oppenheimer is the key proponent against this hydrogen bomb program. So if Strauss discredits him, then there will be no one in his way to create said program, right? But maybe in history he didn't do this. Well, then if that's the case, then you need to create someone. You need to like come up with someone to do this, right? If it's not a real character, then someone else, right? Like that needs to happen. I wish it was Strauss. I'm not sure about the history. If it is, it's great, because I think they did end up creating a hydrogen bomb program, and they did create an arms race with the Soviet Union around this hydrogen bomb, right? So history does this is historically correct. So it's important. I think it's just important to find someone or create someone behind this program who is in direct opposition then to Oppenheimer. So let's just look at what we just talked about in our three act structure laid out like this. So let's just talk about. Talk about what we. So let's just see what we just talked about laid out in our three act structure. So in our opening, we have the here and beginning, the beginning of our frame, right? And then we go into our ordinary world, which you show Oppenheimer's education in his youth, his anxiety attacks, and then we have to give some historical background as to the time of the story, right? With World War II in the 30s, leading up to World War II, and then World War II happening in 39, and then the Manhattan Project coming in 1942, which acts as our inciting incident, which our first push. And then during the debate, which is here, we can see Oppenheimer's relationship with his future wife Kitty, played by Emily Blunt, and then we can see his conflict between whether he thinks the world is ready for atomic weapons. Right, this is the debate part of the story. But in the end, he still decides to become the leader of the Manhattan Project, which works as our Act 1-2 break right here. And then the upside down world, the fun and games as it is, revolves around gathering the team, doing research, using the Oppenheimer hearings to explain story details. And the main obstacle here is solving science problems and the spy, right? Like we talked about adding in the spy as a key obstacle before the midpoint, right? That's before the midpoint as an element that directly hinders the creation of the Manhattan Project or the creation of the atomic bomb. In the midpoint, which is here, Germany surrenders, and then we discover Strauss's real agenda. That is, in my opinion, should be the creation of a hydrogen bomb program. Again, if it's not Strauss, then it's someone else. During the danger closes in, because we found that Strauss's real agenda is to create a hydrogen bomb, Oppenheimer will have no choice but to compromise and continue to create the atomic bomb, because the US is going to use one anyways, because they need to make Japan surrender before the Soviet Union's invasion. All right? So Oppenheimer feels like he has no choice. If they're going to use a bomb, then he rather than use the atomic bomb as opposed to creating a hydrogen bomb anyways. So he agrees to continue researching the atomic bomb, and then we use Soviet Union's impending invasion as a time lock for this part of the movie to create tension, right? Time locks are always good to create tension and pacing. Push 2, which is our all is lost, is actually a all is gained, because the test is successful. This movie is a tragedy, right? Like this movie is a tragic ending. So usually a tragedy will have your second push, your push 2, where your all is lost moment be a all is gained moment. So this is the Trinity test. It is successful, and the awakening after the all is gained moment is that scientists, they awaken to the power of the atomic bomb, and they want Oppenheimer to petition the government to not to use the bomb, right? This is the way it is right now, which is fine. So if Strauss's real agenda is to create a hydrogen bomb program and take over the AEC, which I think he wants to do anyways, which is the way it is, then the second act and third act break is Oppenheimer deciding to fight Strauss's real agenda. So the flight to the airport, the major conflict time, third act, is the US uses the atomic bomb, Japan surrenders, Oppenheimer publicly advocates against the hydrogen bomb program. Right now he goes to see President Truman and says, hey, we shouldn't make any more of these. And President Truman's like, are you out of your mind? We should be making more of these, right? And then he also advocates the cooperation with the Soviets, which leads which leads people to suspect that he is a Russian spy during his hearing, which also makes sense now if he goes and openly advocates cooperation with the Soviets, and if they haven't found a spy here yet, right? Climax is Oppenheimer loses his security clearance to the AEC, and the US creates the hydrogen bomb program, thus starting the arms race with the Soviet Union. And then the end of the movie, the closing moments is now, where the Cold War essentially has begun, and Oppenheimer realizes that the chain reaction cannot be stopped, and he has doomed us all, guys. This is the way it is right now. So by looking at the 3-act structure like this, we see that we kept a lot of the main parts, the key moments of the movie the way it is, like the Manhattan Project has the exciting incident, him becoming the lead as the 1 Act 2 break, the midpoint where Germany surrenders, and then the successful test, and then the end of the movie, right? This is all as is. This is the way the movie is right now. So we actually kept a lot of the elements already. We just rearranged, added in some stuff in between. All right, guys, so that is our analysis and fix for Oppenheimer. I hope you guys have found this useful in your own writing. And I think I just want to end this by just reiterating that Oppenheimer by no means is a bad movie. I think it is very well done, deserving of praise for a lot of people involved, especially the actors and the music and the cinematography. And I think overall, I think a lot of people would have enjoyed this movie. They won't feel like, oh, I wasted my money or my time watching it. But I just feel like something like this could have benefited from a finer comb, as to say, with the story. I think this movie is a real missed opportunity because, sometimes like a historical movie, like history or the real events prevent you from creating something so dramatic because history is really fixed and the timeline is really spread out and you can't really do much with the source material. But this topic, Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project and the creation of the atomic bomb, I don't think suffers from this problem, right? It's a very concentrated time period of 3 years, like 42 to 45, and it's high stress, high tension. Everything's going on, everything to fight for. You got World War II as this great background. You got a very charismatic character, this like super generational talent of a man in our main protagonist. You have all these great supporting characters around him as well, and then you have the height of the Cold War coming in right after. I think this movie, this source material, has everything you need to create something compelling. Structurally, it doesn't suffer like other historical movies because it's not, the timeline is not spread out. I just think I understand Christopher Nolan wanted to create something as real as possible, but in my opinion, people don't want to see something that's so real. Or reality and fidelity to history is not the main reason why people buy a ticket to watch a movie in the movie theater, right? That's the reason why mainstream movie theaters don't play documentaries, or very few of them. That's just the way it is. Like, they understand that audiences pay money to go watch a narrative experience, a narrative dramatic experience, right? And this movie does not deliver on that promise. Whereas I think after going through it with everyone, I think we can see that it could have very easily. So that is Oppenheimer. I hope you guys had a good time watching this video. I hope you learned something. And if you did, stick around. We'll have much more of these videos. And if you want to learn more about screenwriting, check out my Screenwriting Fundamentals playlist. And I'll see you guys next time.